Hey folks, here we are with the third set of discussion around agenda setting, and we'll talk about today power groups and policy change. Now, so the idea around the things we've discussed so far of defining problems and defining solutions and figuring out what actually gets onto the agenda and the ability to push stuff outside of the agenda universe or foster conflict within the decision level of the agenda. All of these things involve political power. Political power is the ability to get things done in a political system. And we have winners and losers, and none of them wins all the time, right? But the idea behind the agenda is absolutely related to political power. And there's two different types of groups. There are losers and winners, right? Just like in a lot of things in our society. The losing groups, those who don't get their idea onto the agenda, those who cannot have control of the narrative to set the agenda, to define the problem, to end up ultimately defining a solution. We call these losing groups. They've been outmaneuvered, they've been outgunned, they're unable to get their ideas on the agenda. And so what all this boils down to is if you have winners and losers, you're in a competition. And so what this means is that the agenda, the policies that we end up having, the things that do come to the fore, it's all based on conflict between groups. We've talked about groups at length. And, this idea is that if you are on the losing side of things, you have a couple different ways to expand the scope of conflict, to get more people to pay attention to the issue, to get them over to your side, to be able to try to become a winning group. Losers want to be winners. And so one thing they do is use symbols to expand the debate, to induce empathy. So they'll start using different images and different stories and different narratives to try to capture more people over and bring them over to their side by kind of appealing to their heartstrings, for instance. And then the other option here is appealing to a different level of government or a different branch of government. So if you lose in the legislative battle, you take it to the courts. If you lose the administrative battle, you take it to the legislature, right? If you lose at the local level, you take it to the state level. If you lose at the state level, you take it to the federal level. This is called venue shopping. And it's an idea that the interest groups do this. Losing groups are going to do this to try to get some sort of sympathetic hearing to bring somebody over to their side. Winning groups, on the other hand, have a policy monopoly over the issue. They control it. They won that policy debate. Their issue was able to get onto the agenda. Their preferred solution was turned into public policy, and now they have this kind of control over the issue. Their goal here is to reinforce their own narrative, to continue to pound their image of the problem, continue to reinforce that so that the impact or the noise coming from losing groups isn't filtering in and peeling off people who support the winning group. So their goal is to keep others off the agenda, to reinforce their own narratives. And then what they're really trying to do here is keep attention focused on other things, right? So if people aren't paying attention to the issue anymore, they're going to control the policy monopoly because we're looking the other way. And we're not going to pay attention to the noise coming from the losing groups. In any sort of political system, there are three types of political power. The first is coercive power. This is forcing others to do what they wouldn't do otherwise. The second type of political power is blocking power. This is preventing people from doing something. And the third one is quiescence or powerlessness. And this is the inability to make any difference or to get your ideas considered at all by the general public. So let's go through these. Coercive power. This is the kind of do it or else. You must do this. We don't really have this type of power in a democratic regime like the United States. This is kind of rare in our policy fights. We cannot force people to do anything, right? It does exist in the military, in the police, sometimes in regulatory enforcement. Certainly it would exist within prisons and jails. And it exists between relationships between adults and their minors that they're in charge of, like parents and kids. But we don't really have this. We can't force people to go the speed limit, for instance, right? You post a sign that says 65 miles per hour speed limit. You're not forcing people to do it, right? If you were, I don't know, you would have policies that didn't allow cars to go beyond 65 miles per hour. But we don't do that type of approach in the United States. But what we do approach policy or power with is blocking power. This is saying no. This is kind of the idea that we are keeping issues off the agenda. We are keeping attention directed toward one thing instead of another. We do blocking power through veto. We do it through filibusters. We do it through stonewalling. We do blocking power through the potential of some sort of punishment, some sort of consequence, right? That speed limit is blocking power, right? It is this idea that you go over the speed limit, there is the potential that you're going to get a ticket. And that ticket, that potential, blocks you from doing it, right? And so you will control your speed or go 80 if it's the freeway or whatever, but you're not going to go beyond that. Just because there is this notion, this threat out there. So in common political arguments, and when it comes to the agenda, the winning group typically has used effectively their blocking power to keep other groups from getting their preferred definition of the problem out into the public, right? Their preferred definition out into the kind of cultural understanding of around an issue, right? We often do this also when we're kind of changing narratives. If we're so loud around a particular topic, we're able to block out the noise from other groups, effectively preventing them from sharing their perspective or their narrative or their definition of an issue. The third one is the kind of a difficult one to kind of compare side by side with these first two. It's just a different form of power, and it's powerlessness. And this is perhaps your group, your whatever it may be, has attempted to impact the public policy process, and they've gotten blocked so many times. They aren't being heard. They aren't being able to influence. They aren't able to break up policy monopolies. So they give up, and they feel powerless. And this happens to, groups like we have here, politically marginalized folks, poor, unhoused, certain ethnic groups. Certainly people have tried time and time again to impact, right, the system, and they just keep getting blocked left and right, and so they give up. This is reinforcing. And it has intergenerational effects too. So if your grandparents really tried to make a big difference and get their voice heard and their impact on the political process made, and they're blocked, maybe their kids, your parents, felt the same way, that hey, they saw their parents try to attempt to do something and it didn't happen, so they're not going to do it either. And then your generation is the same kind of way, right? You're going to stop and not try to have that impact. So this is kind of a truly sad face of political power. All right. So with these things in mind, especially focusing on blocking power, right, which is the most common one that we have in the United States, how do we, if we are especially losing groups, how do we get people to come to our side, right? So maybe you participated in that policy debate and you don't like what the outcome was, or you want change from what the status quo is now. The core strategy you have is conflict expansion. You draw in allies, draw in people who have a sympathetic view to your point of view. Change your description of the problem to attract more people to your side in the policy fight. And also, if you have kind of conflict expansion around one particular public policy issue, it's going to bleed over into related public policy issues. And so you have this whole opportunity for either maintaining the status quo if you have such a strong monopoly over it, or breaking the system and being able to have a large impact across policy domains. What all of this involves: conflict expansion, getting your voice heard, moving from being a loser to a winner. And same thing for those folks who are powerless, is attention. Attention matters in the policy process. This is probably the most key fundamental component of the public policy process, is getting people to pay attention to things. And so groups can do this in a number of different ways. Sometimes indicators, right? Numbers, people, we see numbers, we see charts, and we're like, oh, this looks pretty bad, or that's a large number, or that's a really small number. And we start thinking about that and paying attention to it. Focusing events, so major incidents, natural disasters, scandals, can bring issues to the fore. Things that, we have been talking about it all, it's not on the cover of the newspapers, it's not in the in your news feeds or whatever, but then all of a sudden, boom, a huge hurricane occurs, or a large earthquake, or some sort of terrorist attack, and now it's kind of peak focus on a particular issue, and we're all paying attention to it. That's a moment when policy change can occur, because you have people that are paying attention to it at that time, and they're forcing politicians and policymakers to pay attention to it. Use of symbols, stories, narratives, these things also get people's attention. And you can turn something that's a small kind of local issue, something that happened in one particular place, to a large national movement, right? Just because the attention is being expanded. The George Floyd in 2020, right? The kind of focus on that in Minneapolis, and then boom, expands across the globe. And these things kind of were done through symbols, through stories, through words. But the idea for any kind of notion of getting people to your side, to break up a block, is to get attention to your issue. Attention sets the policy agenda. And so what there ends up becoming this large battle for attention. When we talked about the media in our unofficial actors discussion, the media vie for our attention. They're looking for our clicks, for our likes, for our watching habits, ratings, and things like this. And it's not because they really care about spreading whatever they're trying to discuss, but they want this open market competition for consumable goods, a news. And the same thing here for attention, right? You have this market competition for the public's attention. If you can't get it, you're not going to be able to achieve your policy goal. All right, so this kind of focus on agenda setting, it ends up becoming this battlefield, right? This kind of place for conflict, competition, winners, losers, key focus on trying to get people's attention, the structure of being able to block out other participants because your group has more political power. The idea that the problems that we have in our society have to be socially constructed, right? We have to define them, and people have to buy that definition, right? It is through that process of people paying attention to an issue, you selling your definition of a problem, and people actually believing it more than somebody else's definition of a problem, right? This is how the agenda is set. And if enough people are paying attention to a particular issue, that item is going to come up to the front of the line, and these are going to be things that public policy is made on. The issues that we are deciding as a public. All right, that's it. Next one, we're going to look at policy types. So come back next week for that, and take care.